A beautiful dream. The dreamer is driving with a great number of companions in the X Street, where there is a modest hostelry, which is not the case. A theatrical performance is being given in one of the rooms of the inn. He is first spectator, then actor. Finally, the company is told to change their clothes in order to return to the city. Some of the company are shown to the rooms on the ground floor, others to the room on the first floor. Then a dispute arises. The people upstairs are annoyed because those downstairs have not yet finished changing, so that they cannot come down. His brother is upstairs, he is downstairs, and he is angry with his brother because they are so hurried. This part obscure. Besides, it was already decided upon their arrival who was to go upstairs and who down. Then he goes alone up the hill towards the city, and he walks so heavily and with such difficulty that he cannot move from the spot. An elderly gentleman joins him and talks angrily of the King of Italy. Finally, towards the top of the hill, he is able to walk much more easily. The difficulty experienced in climbing the hill was so distinct that for some time after waking he was in doubt whether the experience was a dream or the reality. Judged by the manifest content, this dream can hardly be eulogized. Contrary to the rules, I shall begin the interpretation with that portion to which the dreamer referred as being the most distinct. The difficulty dreamed of and probably experienced during the dream difficulty in climbing, accompanied by the dysphonia, was one of the symptoms which the patient had actually exhibited some years before, and which, in conjunction with other symptoms, was at the time attributed to tuberculosis, probably strictly simulated. From our study of the exhibition dreams, we are already acquainted with this sensation of being inhibited in motion, peculiar to dreams, and here again we find it utilized as material always available for the purpose of any other kind of representation. The part of the dream content which represents climbing as difficult at first and easier at the top of the hill made me think, while it was being related, of the well-known masterly introduction of Daudet's Sappho. Here, a young man carries the woman he loves upstairs. She is at first as light as a feather, but the higher he climbs, the more she weighs. And this scene is symbolic of the process of their relation, in describing which Daudet seeks to admonish young men not to lavish an earnest affection upon girls of humble origin and dubious antecedents. Although I knew that my patient had recently had a love affair with an actress and had broken it off, I hardly expected to find the interpretation which occurred to me as correct. The situation in Sappho is actually the reverse of that in the dream. For in the dream, climbing was difficult at first and easy later on. In the novel, the symbolism is pertinent only if what was at first easily carried finally proves to be a heavy burden. To my astonishment, the patient remarked that the interpretation fitted in very well with the plot of a play which he had seen in the previous evening. The play was called Rundum Wien, Roundabout Vienna, and treated of the career of a girl who was at first respectable but who subsequently lapsed into the demi-monde and formed relations with the highly placed lovers, thereby climbing, but finally she went downhill faster and faster. This play reminded him of another entitled Fonstufe Susstufe, From Step to Step, the poster advertising which depicted a flight of stairs. To continue the interpretation, the actress with whom he had had his most recent and complicated affair had lived in X Street. There is no inn in the street. However, while he was spending part of the summer in Vienna, for the sake of this lady, he had lodged, German, Abstiegen, meaning stopped, literally stepped off, at a small hotel in the neighborhood. When he was leaving the hotel, he asked the cab driver, "I am glad at all events that I didn't get any vermin here." Incidentally, the dread of the vermin is one of his phobias. Whereupon the cab driver answered, "How could anybody stop there? That isn't a hotel at all. It's really nothing but a pub." The pub immediately reminded him of a quotation of a wonderful host. I was lately a guest. The host in the poem by Holland is an apple tree. Now, a second quotation continues the train of thought. Faust, dancing with a young witch. A lovely dream once came to me. I can behold an apple tree, and there two fairest apples shone. They lured me so I climbed thereon. The fair one. Apples have been desired by you, since first in paradise they grew, and I am moved with joy to know that such within my garden grow. There is not the slightest doubt what is meant by the apple tree and the apples. A beautiful bosom stood high among the charms by which the actress had bewitched our dreamer. Judging by the context of the analysis, we had every reason to assume that the dream referred to an impression of the dreamer's childhood. If this is correct, it must be referred to the wet nurse of the dreamer, who is now a man of nearly 30 years of age. The bosom of the nurse is in reality an inn for the child. The nurse, as well as Dodit Sappho, appears as an illusion to his recently abandoned mistress. The elder brother of the patient also appears in the dream content. He is upstairs while the dreamer himself is downstairs. This again is an inversion, for the brother, as I happen to know, has lost his social position, while my patient has retained his. In relating the dream content, the dreamer avoided saying that his brother was upstairs and that he himself was downstairs. This would have been an obvious expression, for in Austria, we say that a man is on the ground floor when he has lost his fortune and social position, just as we say that he has come down. Now, the fact at this point in the dream something is represented as inverted must have a meaning, and the inversion must apply to some other relation between the dream thoughts and the dream content. There is an indication which suggests how this inversion is to be understood. It obviously applies to the end of the dream, where the circumstances of climbing are the reverse of those described in Sappho. Now it is evident what inversion is meant. In Sappho, the man carries the woman who stands in a sexual relation to him. In the dream thoughts, conversely, there is a reference to a woman carrying a man, and as this could occur only in childhood, the reference is once more to the nurse who carries the heavy child. Thus, the final portion of the dream succeeds in representing Sappho and the nurse in the same allusion. Just as the name Sappho has not been selected by the poet without the reference to lesbian practice, so the portions of the dream in which people are busy upstairs and downstairs, above and beneath, point to the fantasies of the sexual content with which the dreamer is occupied, and which, as suppressed carvings, are not unconnected with this neurosis. Dream interpretation itself does not show that these are fancies and not memories of actual happenings. It only furnishes us with a set of thoughts and leaves it to us to determine their actual value. In this case, real and imagined happenings appear at first as of equal value, and not only here, but also in the creation of more important psychic structures than dreams. A large company, as we already know, signifies a secret. The brother is none other than a representative drawn into the scenes of childhood by fancying backwards of all the subsequent for women's favors. Through the medium of an experience indifferent in itself, the episode of the gentleman who talks angrily of the king of Italy refers to the intrusion of people of low rank into aristocratic society. It is as though a warning which Dudet gives to young men were to be supplemented by a similar warning applicable to a suckling child. The fantastic nature of the situation relating the dreamer's wetness is shown by the circumstance, objectively ascertained, that the nurse in this case was his mother. In the two dreams here cited, I have shown by italics where one of the elements of the dream recurs in the dream thoughts, in order to make the multiple relations of the former more obvious. Since, however, the analysis of these dreams has not been carried to completion, it will probably be worthwhile to consider a dream with a full analysis in order to demonstrate the manifold determination of the dream content. For this purpose, I shall select the dream of Irma's injection, see chapter 2. From this example, we shall readily see that the condensation work in the dream formation has made use of more means than one. The chief person in the dream content is my patient Irma, who is seen with the features which belong to her waking life, and who therefore, in the first instance, represents herself, but her attitude as I examine her at the window is taken from a recollection of another person, of the lady for whom I should like to exchange my patient, as is shown by the dream thoughts. Inasmuch as Irma has a diphtheritic memory, which recalls my anxiety about my eldest daughter, she comes to represent this child of mine, behind whom, connected with her by the identity of their names, is concealed the person of the patient who died from the effects of the poison. In the further course of the dream, the significance of Irma's personality changes without the alteration of her image as it is seen in the dream. She becomes one of the children whom we examine in the public dispensaries for children's diseases, where my friends display the difference in their mental capacities. The transition was obviously affected by the idea of my little daughter. Owing to her unwillingness to open her mouth, the same Irma constitutes an allusion to another lady who was examined by me, and also in the same connection to my wife. Further, in the morbid changes which I discover in her throat, I have summarized allusions to quite a number of other persons. All these people whom I encounter as I follow up the associations suggested by Irma do not appear personally in the dream. They are concealed behind the dream person Irma, who is thus developed into collective image, which, as might be expected, has contradictory features. Irma comes to represent these other persons who are discarded in the work of condensation, inasmuch as I follow anything to happen to her which reminds me of these persons, trait by trait. For the purposes of the dream condensation, I may construct a composite person in yet another fashion, by combining the actual features of two or more persons in a single dream image. It is in this fashion that the Dr. M of my dream was constructed. He bears the name Dr. M and he speaks and acts as Dr. M does, but his bodily characteristics and his malady belong to another person, my elder brother. A single feature, paleness, is doubly determined, owing to the fact that it is common to both persons. Dr. R in my dream about my uncle is a similar composite person, but here the dream image is constructed in yet another fashion. I have not united features peculiar to the one person with the features of the other, thereby abridging by certain features the memory picture of each, but I have adopted the method employed by Galton in producing family portraits, namely, I have superimposed the two images so that the common features stand out in stronger relief, while those which do not coincide neutralize one another and become indistinct. In the dream of my uncle, the fair beard stands out in relief as an emphasized feature from a physiognomy which belongs to two persons and which is consequently blurred. Further, in its reference to growing grey, the beard contains an allusion to my father and to myself. The construction of collective and composite persons is one of the principal methods of dream condensation. We shall presently have occasion to deal with this in another connection. The notion of dysentery in the dream of Irma's injection was likewise a multiple determination. On the one hand, because of paraphasic assonance with diphtheria, and on the other because of its reference to the patient whom I sent to the east and whose hysteria had been wrongly diagnosed. The mention of propiles in the dream proves again to be an interesting case of condensation. Not propiles but amiles were included in the dream thoughts. One might think that here is a simple displacement had occurred in the course of the dream formation. This is in fact the case, but the displacement serves the purpose of the condensation, as is shown by the following supplementary analysis. If I dwell for a moment upon the word propyline, German, its assonance with the word propylium suggests itself to me. But propylium is to be found not only in Athens but also in Munich. In the latter city, a year before my dream, I had visited a friend who was seriously ill, and the reference to him in trimethylamine, which follows closely upon propyls, is unmistakable. I pass over the striking circumstances that here, as elsewhere in the analysis of dreams, associations of most widely differing values are employed by making thought connections as though they were equivalent, and I yield to the temptation to regard the procedure by which amiles in the dream thoughts are replaced in the dream content by propiles as a sort of plastic process. On the one hand, here is a group of ideas relating to my friend Otto, who does not understand me, thinks I am in the wrong, and gives me the liquor that smells of amiles. On the other hand, there is a group of ideas connected with the first, by contrast, relating to my Berlin friend, who does understand me, who would always think that I was right, and to whom I am indebted for so much valuable information concerning the chemistry of sexual processes. What elements in the Otto group are to attract my particular attention are determined by the recent circumstances which are responsible for the dream. Amiles belong to the elements so distinguished, which are predestined to find their way into the dream content. The large group of ideas centering upon William is actually stimulated by the contrast between William and Otto, and those elements in it are emphasized which are in tune with those already stirred up in the Otto group. In the whole of this dream, I am continually recoiling from somebody who excites my displeasure towards another person with whom I can at will confront the first. Trait by trait, I appeal to the friend as against the enemy. Thus, Amiles in the Otto group awakes recollections in the other group, also belonging to the region of chemistry. Trimethylamine, which receives support from several quarters, finds its way into the dream content. Amiles too might have got into the dream content unchanged, but yields to the influence of the William group, inasmuch as out of the old range of recollections covered by this name an element is sought out which is able to furnish a double determination for Amiles. Propiles is closely associated with Amiles. From the William group comes Munich with its propylium, but both groups are united in the propiles propylium. As though by a compromise, this intermediate element then makes its way into the dream content. Here a common mean which permits of a multiple determination has been created. It thus becomes palpable that a multiple determination must facilitate penetration into the dream content. For the purpose of this dream formation, a placement of the attention has been unhesitatingly effected, what is really intended, to something adjacent to its associations. The study of the dream of Irma's injection has now enabled us to obtain some insight into the process of condensation which occurs in the formation of dreams. We perceive as peculiarities of the condensing process a selection of those elements which occur several times over in the dream content. The formation of new unities, composite persons, mixed images, and the production of the common means. The purpose which is served by the condensation and the means by which it is brought about will be investigated when we come to the study, in all their bearings, the psychic process at work in the formation of dreams. Let us for the present be content with establishing the fact of dream condensation as the relation between the dream thoughts and the dream content which deserves the attention. The condensation work of dreams becomes most palpable when it takes words and means as its objects. Generally speaking, words are often treated in dreams as things and therefore undergo the same combination as idea of things. The result of such dreams are comical and bizarre word formations. 1. A colleague sent an essay of his in which he had, in my opinion, overestimated the value of a recent physiological discovery, and he had expressed himself, moreover, in extravagant terms. On the following night, I dreamed a sentence which is obviously referred to this essay. That is truly Noractile style. The solution of this word formation at first gave me some difficulty. It was unquestionably formed as a parody of the superlative colossal pyramidal, but it is not easy to say where it came from. At last the monster fell apart into the two names, Nora and Egdal, from the two well-known plays by Ibsen. I had previously read a newspaper article on Ibsen by the writer, whose latest work I was now criticizing in the dream. 2. One of my female patients dreams that a man with a fair beard and a peculiar glittering eye is pointing to a signboard attached to a tree which reads, Euclemparia, wet. Analysis. The man was rather authoritative looking, and his peculiar glittering eye at once recalled the church of San Paolo near Rome, where she had seen the mosaic portraits of the popes. One of the early popes had a golden eye. This is really an optical illusion to which the guides usually call attention. Further associations showed that the general physiognomy of the man corresponded with her own clergyman, and the shape of the fair beard recalled her doctor, myself, while the stature of the man in the dream recalled her father. All these persons stand in the same relation to her. They are all guiding and directing the course of her life. On further questioning, the golden eye recalled the gold money, the rather expensive psychoanalytic treatment which gives her a great deal of concern. Gold, moreover, recalls the gold cure for alcoholism. Her D, whom she would have married if it had not been for his clinging to the disgusting alcohol habit, she does not object to anyone's taking an occasional drink. She herself sometimes drinks beer and liquors. This again brings her back to a visit to San Paolo and its surroundings. She remembers that in the neighboring monastery of the Tre Fontaine, She drank a liquor made of eucalyptus by the Trappist monks of the monastery. She then relates how the monks transformed this malarial and swampy region into a dry and wholesome neighborhood by planting numbers of eucalyptus trees. The word euclaperia, which resolves itself into eucalyptus and malaria, and the word wet refers to the former swampy nature of the locality. Wet also suggests dry. Dry is actually the name of the man whom she would have married but for his overindulgence in alcohol. The peculiar name of Dry is of Germanic origin, dry, meaning tree, and hence alludes to the monastery of the three dry fountains. In talking of Mr. Dry's habit, she used the strong expression, he could drink a fountain. Mr. Dry jocosely refers to his habit by saying, "You know I must drink because I am always dry," referring to his name. The eucalyptus refers also to her neurosis, which was at first diagnosed as malaria. She went to Italy because her attacks of anxiety, which were accompanied by marked rigors and shivering, were thought to be of malarial origin. She brought some eucalyptus oil from the monks, and she maintains that it was done her much good. The condensation euclaperia wet is therefore the point of junction for the dream as well as the neurosis. 3. In a rather long and confused dream of my own, the apparent nucleus of which is a sea voyage, it occurs to me that the next port is Hersing, and the next after that Fleece. The latter is the name of my friend in B, to which city I have often journeyed. But Hersing is put together from the names of the places in the neighborhood of Vienna, which so frequently end with ing, Heidsing, Leising, Modeling, the old Medlitz, Mes Deliciae, my joy, that is, my own name, the German for joy being Freude, and the English Hearsay, which points to calumny and establishes the relation to the indifferent dream stimulus of the day. A poem in Flieg and Blatter about a slanderous dwarf, sagt hat gesagt, by the combination of the final syllabi ing with the name Fleece, Flissingen is obtained, which is a real port through which my brother passes when he comes to visit us from England. But the English for Flissingen is Flushing, which signifies blushing and recalls patients suffering from erythrophobia, fear of blushing, whom I sometimes treat, and also a recent publication of Best Truths relating to this neurosis, the reading of which angered me. The same analysis and synthesis of syllables, a veritable chemistry of syllables, serves us for many a jest in waking life. What is the cheapest method of obtaining silver? You go to a field where silver berries are growing and pick them. Then the berries are eliminated and the silver remains in free state. The first person who read and criticized this book made an objection, with which the other readers will probably agree, that the dreamer often appears too witty. That is true, so long as it applies to the dreamer. It involves a condemnation only when its application is extended to the interpreter of the dream. In waking reality, I can make very little claim to the predicate witty. If my dream appear witty, that is not the fault of my individuality, but of the peculiar psychological conditions under which the dream is fabricated and is intimately connected with the theory of wit and comical. The dream becomes witty because the shortest and most direct way to the expression of its thoughts is barred for it. The dream is under constraint. My reader may convince themselves that the dreams of my patients give the impression of being quite as witty, at least in intention, as my own, and even more so. Nevertheless, this reproach impelled me to compare the technique of wit with the dream work. 4. Upon another occasion, I had a dream which consisted of two separate parts. The first was the vividly remembered word autodidasker, and the second was a faithful reproduction in the dream content of a short and harmless fancy which had been developed a few days earlier, and which was to effect that I must tell Professor N when I next saw him. The patient about whose condition I last consulted you is really suffering from neurosis, just as you suspected. So not only must the newly coined word autodidasker satisfy the requirement that it should contain or represent a compressed meaning, but this meaning must have a valid connection with my resolve repeated from waking life to give Professor N due credit for his diagnosis. Now, Autodidasker is easily separated into author, German author, autodidact, and Lasker, with whom is associated the name Lassalle. The first of these words leads me to the occasion of the dream, which this time is significant. I had brought home to my wife several volumes of a well known author who is a friend of my brother's and who, as I have learned, comes from the same neighborhood as myself, J.J. David. One evening she told me how profoundly impressed she had been by the pathetic sadness of a story in one of David's novels, a story of wasted lands, and our conversation turned into signs of talent which we perceive in our own children. Under the influence of what she had read, my wife expressed some concern about our children, and I comforted her with the remark that precisely such degree as she feared can be averted by training. During the night, my thoughts proceeded farther, took up my wife's concern for the children, and interwove with it all sorts of other things. Something which the novelist had said to my brother on the subject of marriage showed my thoughts a path which might lead to representation in the dream. This path led to Breslau. A lady who was a very good friend of ours had married and gone to live there. I found in Breslau Lasker and Lassalle two examples to justify the fear lest our boy should be ruined by women. Examples which enabled me to represent simultaneously two ways of influencing a man to his undoing. The Churchill affirm, by which these thoughts may be summarized, leads me, if taken in another sense, to my brother, who is still married and whose name is Alexander. Now I see that Alex, as we abbreviate the name, sounds almost like an inversion of Lasker, and that this fact must have contributed to send my thoughts on a detour by way of Breslau. But the playing with names and syllables in which I am here engaged has yet another meaning. It represents the wish that my brother may enjoy a happy family life, and this in the following manner. In the novel of artistic life, Le Ouvre, which by virtue of its content must have been in association with my dream thoughts, the author, as is well known, has incidentally given a description of his own person and his own domestic happiness, and appears under the name of Sandoz. In the metamorphosis of his name, he probably went to work as follows. Zola, when inverted, gives aloes, but this was still too undisguised. He therefore replaced the last syllable al, which stands at the beginning of the name Alexander, by the third syllable of the same name, and thus arrived at Sandoz. My Autodidasker originates in a similar fashion. My fantasy that I am telling Professor N that the patient whom we have both seen is suffering from neurosis found its way into the dream in the following manner. Shortly before the close of my working year, I had a patient in whose case my powers of diagnosis failed me. The serious organic trouble, possibly some alternative degeneration of the spinal cord, was to be assumed, but could not be conclusively demonstrated. It would have been tempting to diagnose the trouble as a neurosis, and this would have put an end to all my difficulties, but for the fact of the sexual anamnesis, failing which I am unwilling to admit a neurosis, was so energetically denied by the patient. In my embarrassment, I called to my assistance a physician whom I respect most of all men, and to whose authority I surrendered most completely. He listened to my doubts and told me he thought them justified, and then said, "Keep on observing the man, it is probably a neurosis." Since I know that he does not share my opinions concerning the etiology of the neurosis, I refrained from contradicting him, but I did not conceal my skepticism. A few days later, I informed the patient that I did not know what to do with him and advised him to go to someone else. Thereupon, to my great astonishment, he began to beg my pardon for having lied to me. He had felt so ashamed, and he now revealed to me just a piece of sexual etiology which I had expected, and which I found necessary for assuming the existence of a neurosis. This was a relief to me, but at the same time a humiliation, for I had to admit that my consultant, who was not disconcerted by the absence of anamnesis, had judged the case more correctly. I made up my mind to tell him, when I next saw him, that he had been right and I had been wrong. This is just what I do in the dream. But what sort of a wish is fulfilled if I acknowledge that I am mistaken? This is precisely my wish. I wish to be mistaken as regards my fears, that is to say, I wish that my wife, whose fears I have appropriated in my dream thoughts, may prove to be mistaken. The subject to which the fact of being right or wrong is related in the dream is not far remote from that which is really of interest to the dream thoughts. We have the same pair of alternatives of either organic or functional impairment caused by a woman, or actually by the sexual life, either diabetic paralysis or a neurosis, with which latter the nature of Lassalle's undoing is indirectly connected. In this well constructed dream, Professor N appears not merely on the account of his analogy and my wish to be proved mistaken, or associated references to Breslau and the family of our married friend who lives there, but also on the account of the following little dialogue which followed our consultation. After he had acquitted himself to his professional duties by making the above mentioned suggestion, Dr. N proceeded to discuss personal matters. How many children have you now? 6. A thoughtful and respectful gesture. Girls, boys? 3 each. They are the pride of my riches. Well, you must be careful. There is no difficulty about the girls, but the boys are a difficulty later on as regards their upbringing. I replied that until now they had been very tractable. Obviously, this prognosis of my boy's future pleased me as little as the diagnosis of my patient, whom he believed to be suffering only from a neurosis. These two impressions, then, are connected by their continuity, by their being successively received. And when I incorporate the story of the neurosis into the dream, I substitute it for the conversation on the subject of the upbringing, which is even more closely connected with the dream thoughts, since it touches so closely upon the anxiety subsequently expressed by my wife. Thus, even my fear that N may prove to be right in his remarks on the difficulties to be met with in bringing up boys is admitted into the dream content, inasmuch as it is concealed behind the representation of my wish that I may be wrong to harbour such apprehensions. The same fantasy serves, without alteration, to represent both the conflicting alternatives. Examination dreams present the same difficulties to the interpretation that I have already described as characteristic of most typical dreams. The associative material which the dreamer supplies only rarely suffices for the interpretation. A deeper understanding of such dreams has to be accumulated from the considerable number of examples. Not long ago, I arrived at a conviction that reassurances like, "But you're already a doctor," and so on, not only convey a consolation but imply a reproach as well. This would have run, "You're already so old, so far advanced in life, and yet you will commit such follies, are guilty of such childish behavior." This mixture of self-criticism and consolation would correspond with the examination dreams. After this, it is no longer surprising that the reproaches in the last analyzed examples concerning follies and childish behaviors should relate to the repetitions of the reprehensible sexual acts. The verbal transformations in the dream are very similar to those which are known to occur in paranoia, and which are observed also in hysteria and obsession. The linguistic tricks of children who at a certain age actually treat words as objects and even invent new language and artificial syntaxes are a common source of such occurrences both in dreams and psychoneuroses. The analysis of nonsensical word formation in dreams is particularly well suited to demonstrate the degree of condensation affected in the dream work. From the small number of selected examples here considered, it must not be concluded that such material is seldom observed, or is it at all exceptional. It is, on the contrary, very frequent, but owing to the dependence of dream interpretation on psychoanalytic treatment, very few examples are noted down and reported, and most of the analyses which are reported are comprehensible only to the specialist in neuropathology. When a spoken utterance, expressly distinguished as such from a thought, occurs in a dream, it is an invariable rule that the dream speech has originated from remembered speech in the dream material. The wording of the speech has either been preserved in its entirety or has been slightly altered in expression. Frequently, the dream speech is pieced together from different recollections of spoken remarks. The wording has remained the same, but the sense has perhaps become ambiguous or differs from the wording, Not infrequently, the dream speech serves merely as an allusion to an incident in connection with which the remembered speech was made. In the case of a young man who was suffering from the obsessions but whose intellectual functions were intact and highly developed, I recently found the only exception to this rule. The speeches which occurred in his dreams did not originate in speeches which he had heard and made himself, but correspond to the undistorted verbal expression of his obsessive thoughts, which came to his waking conscious only in an altered form.